Okay, so I'll get started with some introductions and people can filter in. So welcome to our last session today. I'm Britta Brzezina from the Institute of Education Sciences. I work at NICSR. Welcome to our session here on the impact of reading research through implementation science. So I'm going to introduce Jess Tost. So Jess is an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. She holds research affiliations with the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk and Texas Center for Equity Promotion, and is a fellow with the IES-funded Research Institute for Implementation Science and Education, or RISE. Her research is focused on methods for intensifying intervention for students with persistent reading challenges and reading disabilities, and she is PI on multiple research grants for the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences. She's associate editor for the Journal of Learning Disabilities, current president of CEC's Division for Learning Disabilities, and vice president for CEC's Division for Research. Dr. Tost is an award-winning teacher, most recently the recipient of the President's Associates Graduate Teaching Excellence Award at UT Austin, and she is extensively involved in community service and advocacy as a member of the board of directors of GLSEN, and previous board chair of Disability Rights Texas. So Jess, I will let you introduce the rest of your team.
All right, thank you. I think we have a slide with our pictures that we can look at while I do introductions, and I will apologize because I didn't prepare as long of an introduction, but I will put together everyone's accolades later and throw them into the chat. There are many of them. So my name is Jessica Tost, as you just heard, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce the other speakers on this panel. We all came together through RISE, which is the Research Institute on Implementation Science and Education, and are excited to chat with you today. So we have, and when I say your name, you can kind of wave so people can see your square and your photo. So we have Dr. Aaron Lyon. Aaron is a professor at the University of Washington, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He's co-director of the UW Smart Center and Implementation Research Center, and his research focuses primarily on the implementation of high-quality, multi-tiered programming to enhance students' social, emotional, behavioral well-being, and he's the director and PI of RISE. Then we have Dr. Nicole Patton-Terry, who's on the screen in multiple places. And Nicole is a professor in the School of Teacher Education at Florida State University. She is the director of the Florida Center for Reading Research and director of the Regional Education Lab Southeast, REL Southeast. Nicole's research, innovation, and engagement activities focuses on young learners who are vulnerable to experiencing difficulty with language and literacy achievement in school, in particular Black children, children growing up in poverty, and children with disabilities. We have on the screen, but not going to wave at you, is Dr. Sarah Hart. Sarah is not with us here today, but she is the co-director of one of the training programs that Dr. Patton-Terry will be discussing a little later. And Sarah is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University and the Florida Center for Reading Research. Next, we have Dr. Tricia Zecker. And Tricia is also a fellow with RISE. She is the co-director of the Children's Learning Institute at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. Tricia's research interests include early identification and prevention of reading disabilities, evidence-based curriculum and instruction, effective use of technology for learning, family and school-based interventions, and early childhood assessment. And then we have Dr. Michael Mesa, trying to see everybody on my screen as I go. And Michael is a postdoctoral researcher at the Children's Learning Institute at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. His work focuses on factors that can act as facilitators and barriers to young children's language, literacy, and behavioral skill development, including the influence of peers, small group composition, behavior management strategies, and culturally relevant pedagogy. So this is our group today. I will spend just 1 minute telling you the overview of how we're going to approach this interactive session. We are truly going to try to make it as interactive as possible. So we're going to start with a brief introduction to implementation science. So Dr. Lyon will present that for about 20 minutes to kind of go through core key components and terminology to keep in mind as we move into our discussion. And then we're going to have 3 breakout rooms. You'll be able to choose which topic you're interested in and join us for discussion. And in the breakout rooms, each of the presenters will have just a few slides to sort of set the stage of the main topic they're talking about. And then we will open it up really for discussion and engagement around that topic. So we're going to keep the topic secret for a little bit longer, but then we'll tell you the theme of each room and you can choose which to join. And we'll end off just coming back just to debrief and have some takeaways before we leave for the afternoon. All right, so I will hand it over.
Thanks so much, Jess. Now for the least interactive part of this very interactive session. This is where I'm just going to give you a little bit of a whirlwind introduction to implementation science for those who might not be familiar with it. These are a lot of the things that we dive really deeply into at RISE that I have the pleasure of being the one of the core faculty and the overall director of. But RISE and so much implementation science work in education, I think, is summed up in this quote from a number of years back from Mark Schneider, IES director, that we need to figure out the best channels to get information into the hands of teachers so that more students have teachers who are using the most effective evidence-based methods. And this is, in a lot of ways, I think, a rallying cry to one extent or another that we have in RISE and implementation science, because I think it really sums up the need for bridging that research to practice gap, which implementation science is here to try to do. First, I want to take you back to what might be the first documented research to practice gap. So scurvy was a major problem for seafaring nations way back in the 1600s and before. Lemon juice was shown to be effective in preventing scurvy in 1601. Lemon juice was not introduced into sailors' diets on ships until 1795. Now this, for those doing the math, translates into a 194-year research to practice gap. And although we're doing a little bit better these days, there's still a lot of opportunity for improvement, and we're not doing as well as we might think. I want to pause here and just talk a little bit about access and effectiveness. A lot of us, especially some of us in the social, emotional, and behavioral space, we do work in schools for a lot of different reasons. We believe in the educational mission of school buildings and districts. We also really see a lot of opportunity for the access to social, emotional, and behavioral curricula, access to educational interventions that schools provide. But access does not always mean effectiveness. And therefore, we also focus a lot on enhancing quality, because it doesn't matter how accessible your service is if it's not a high quality service that's likely to have an impact. Similarly, it doesn't matter how effective your intervention is if no one ever receives it. And that's why we think of access and service quality as complementary and interdependent. What I'm going to be talking about a lot now is enhancing quality. And I want to just draw your attention to this pyramid and these different sort of levels of ways that practices can come out into the world. The first is diffusion. This is passive spread, such as a new innovation that's spread between teachers by word of mouth. If I try out a new intervention and I tell Jess about it, or I tell Nicole about it, and they pick up the manual or those materials, that's an example of diffusion. Dissemination refers to the targeted distribution of information to a specific audience with the intent of spreading knowledge. I think of all the different things in this pyramid, maybe Mark Schneider's quote earlier talks maybe most directly to dissemination, right? Getting information to a particular audience. Very important, and an important stepping stone toward implementation. Implementation refers to the sort of active use of specific strategies to adopt and integrate new interventions, evidence-based curricula, maybe they're health interventions across all manner of sectors to change practice patterns within those settings and make sure people are getting the best services that they can. And if you think about it as a continuum, it's really letting it happen, helping it happen, and making it happen. And here today and at RISE, we're really interested in making it happen. As implementation as a field has grown, like any field that has sort of reached a certain level of maturity, implementation has now come to have two important and also interdependent and complementary parts. Implementation researchers, those folks who are most directly supporting in our RISE fellowship, people who are engaged in the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings into routine practice, really oriented toward developing generalizable knowledge about practice change. And the people engaged in this work are implementation researchers and scientists. There's also the really critical work that implementation practitioners do every day, who may not be oriented toward producing generalizable knowledge, but are sure there to support practice change in real world settings. These are people who might be called implementation practitioners, purveyors, intermediaries, people who are doing a lot of technical assistance, but maybe not with a research agenda. I just wanted to put that out there as part of the landscape of contemporary implementation, research, and practice, because it's important to sort of think of the ways that people can differentiate within a field. And of course, like all science and practice components of any field, they're both absolutely critical. I'm going to touch now on what I'm calling some basic building blocks of implementation, both implementation research and implementation practice. The first is implementation frameworks. And these are proposed models of factors that sort of detail what's likely to impact or how it's likely to impact implementation and sustainment of an evidence-based practice. There's a lot of different kinds of frameworks out there. Some are what we call determinant frameworks that list a lot of barriers and facilitators. Some are process models that describe or guide the process of translating research into practice. In implementation, sometimes we make use of classic theories like the theory of planned behavior or more sort of emerging implementation specific theories. And there's also evaluation frameworks. Turns out within implementation these days, we've had quite a proliferation of frameworks. At last count, over 100. So if you're thinking about creating a new implementation framework, we're good, we're probably good. But it's also led some people to observe that frameworks are like toothbrushes, and everyone has one, and nobody wants to use anybody else's. Jumping into a little more key terminology, I'm going to talk just really briefly about implementation determinants, strategies, outcomes, and mechanisms. And this is a bit of a sort of heuristic model here for implementation research and practice, but maybe most specified within implementation research. I also want to point out that increasingly, as within a lot of intervention research, we're starting to look at the mechanisms through which some of our interventions in implementation, which tend to be implementation strategies like training, coaching, leadership-oriented supports that might create a more conducive organizational context, that these kinds of strategies may be impacting mechanisms that we're also looking to specify and begin to capture in a lot of our science. So I'm going to start just by talking about determinants. These are barriers and facilitators. Within implementation, we've said the words barriers and facilitators so many times, we decided to start saying determinants instead, to save a little time. But these are factors that obstruct or enable changes in targeted professional behaviors or service delivery processes. There was a review that identified 601 plausible determinants of practice change. So there's a whole lot of things out there. And one of the things we try to do within contemporary implementation science is figure out what are the most important and what are the most malleable determinants that we can target through our change efforts. Determinants are also multi-level. They could be at the individual level, someone's attitudes. They could be at the organizational level, and a particular buildings or districts, organizational climate, and implementation specific climate that might make it more or less conducive to an implementation effort. We have implementation strategies, and a lot of contemporary focus in implementation research has been on the identification and testing of implementation strategies. And these are targeted processes that are trying to make it happen, if you think back to that pyramid that I was showing you before. These could be planning strategies, which could be gathering data, building initial buy-in, education strategies, training, which is a cornerstone implementation strategy in most efforts that I've been involved in. Perhaps financial strategies for how you're actually going to resource a practice change or the delivery of some sort of new innovation. Perhaps organizational restructuring, maybe even attending to the policy context. At the very end of this, I'm going to talk about some sort of emerging or cutting edge, one might say, depends on who you ask, issues in implementation science, and increasing focus on dissemination, strategic dissemination of information to policymakers for the purposes of influencing policy and creating even state level policies that can be more conducive to evidence, and the use of research evidence is one of those. Implementation outcomes. There's a few different implementation outcome frameworks, but most often people tend to talk about acceptability, adoption, appropriateness, cost, feasibility, fidelity. Fidelity often gets top billing in discussion of implementation outcomes, especially within education, penetration or reach, and ultimate sustainment. But this is really the logic chain through which implementation outcomes are really going to benefit the things that matter. Satisfaction with services or satisfaction with education, symptoms if you're focusing on something that could be a health-oriented kind of intervention, and academic success, which are really what we're trying to get to through better articulation of this logic chain. A quick note about intervention versus implementation research, because this is this reflects a discussion that we've had a lot at RISE, and when and if it matters whether you're conducting intervention versus implementation research. I think it's important to note that although I'm going to differentiate the two, you can of course do both simultaneously, especially if you're conducting what we call hybrid effectiveness implementation trials. And if you're interested in those, I won't really talk about them anymore, but I suggest you go look up some work by Jeff Curran talking about how, to some extent or another, you can and should have your cake and eat it too, if you want to look at impact of an intervention as well as important implementation factors. Intervention research, which people are on this call in this room are probably most familiar with, is often student-facing with proximal outcomes at the student level. It might be behavior, it might be academic learning, may also include teacher wellness. Often concerned with intervention effectiveness or impact, right? Does this intervention program or practice improve outcomes for those who receive them? And also, is an intervention doing more harm than good for a target population in a real-world setting? Implementation research, the systematic study of methods that support the application of research findings and other evidence-based knowledge in policy and practice, is frequently, or at least increasingly, focused on the evaluation of implementation strategies. Sometimes it's more formative work that might lead to developing implementation strategies, but often what we're trying to do is to specify sort of those particular practices that we can use and that may be generalizable across different kinds of interventions to support the uptake, the adoption of new programs. I want to just touch for a moment before I wrap up on how all of this can be done within the existing project structure within IES. We've had some conversations at RISE and other places about, does there need to be an implementation project type? And I'm not sure there does. Here's just some examples, and I won't run through all of them, of ways that project types have been or could be leveraged in order to do implementation research. Measurement, of course, you could develop and validate measures of things like organizational readiness to implement EVPs. I think the more that these measures can be focused across different kinds of interventions, the better, rather than sort of focusing just on one particular type of intervention. So it can be generalizable, and so it can contribute to this broader sort of scientific understanding of implementation processes. Development and innovation. Development and testing. We have a project focused on development and testing of a leadership-focused intervention that ultimately improves the teacher delivery of universal prevention programs surrounding social, emotional, behavioral health. Plenty of other options as well. I won't walk through all of them, so we have time to get you into your breakout groups. One of the things I'll finish with that I promised earlier are, this is not an exhaustive list, and some of this is really just my perspective, so your mileage may vary. But cutting edge topics within implementation research. One, I was already talking about implementation mechanisms. What comes between an implementation strategy, a training strategy perhaps, and an implementation outcome? What are the changes in people, in systems that flow from that and ultimately cause someone to adopt and deliver with fidelity a new intervention? Strategic intervention and implementation strategy adaptation, recognizing that to one extent or another, there is no implementation without adaptation. And how can we do that prospectively and explicitly? De-adoption or de-implementation. We have a lot of low value practices out there that we might want to move out in very strategic ways in order to make room for new programs. Often we just pile on more and more and more, and no one appreciates that in our buildings and our districts. But if we can excavate and carve out things that aren't necessarily doing the job and replace them, I think we have a lot more opportunity to be successful. Disparities and equity in implementation processes and outcomes. Even if an implementation effort is successful, is it successful for everyone? Or are we actually running the risk of increasing service disparities or disparities in access to evidence-based practices if majority groups who may already be benefiting more are more likely to uptake and deliver an effective intervention? Effective community engagement processes. Policy-focused dissemination to enhance implementation. That's what I was already talking about. There's been a lot of work lately in the broader implementation science space surrounding ways to very effectively target those communications in order to have that higher level impact. So like we said at the beginning, RISE is what brought us together, and it's really exciting because RISE isn't just about creating, knowledge in individuals surrounding implementation research and methodologies. It's about creating networks, and we're also trying to take our own advice within implementation. There's sort of a well-established finding that train and hope doesn't work. Train and hope is not a particularly effective tool for practice change. Ongoing support and ongoing interactions are good ways to change teacher behavior if you're asking them to adopt a new curriculum. And it's a good way to change and influence researcher behavior by creating lots of opportunities for interaction, for wrestling with concepts, for giving and receiving feedback. So I hope you look into RISE. So far, we've had one cohort, and we'll have our second cohort coming this summer. And we are hoping to continue the RISE fun by submitting sort of continuation, not renewal grants, but continuation grants to be able to respond to just the really humbling interest we've seen among people who would like to be part. Maybe now I'll toss it back to Jess.
All right, thanks, Aaron. So I am going to introduce our breakout rooms, and then we will open them and you can decide where you want to go. And we are going to take about 20 to 25 minutes in the breakout rooms. And Aaron is going to be the one who forces us all to come back at the end, no matter where we are in our conversation. So in breakout room 1, we're going to have Dr. Patton Terry, who is going to be focusing on doctoral students and early career scholars. In breakout room 2, that will be me, Jessica Tost, and we're going to be talking about teachers' database decision-making. And in breakout room 3, we'll have Dr. Zucker and Dr. Mesa, who will be talking about early reading intervention. So I will open the breakout rooms right now. There is a shorthand on the topic, so you can just choose whatever one you like, and we will see you there momentarily.
Aaron, we totally didn't have enough time. We were just getting to discussing.
Try to split the difference.
We want 5 or 10 minutes back.
Always the way.
Well, we could, if anyone has any other thoughts, either the presenters of each room that you want to share back, or if anyone who was in a room had something they wanted to share that they didn't have a chance to and now wants to share it in front of everybody, now's the time. Do we want to start with Nicole, Trisha, me, Michael? Any thoughts you wanted to share back?
I'm sure. And again, guys, use your raise hand function if you have comments or things you want to ask. We really only got to talk about one thing, but I think it was a really important point, which was that there is a tension in this work when you're training students or junior scholars, as well as yourself engaging in this work. There's still hesitation around the rigor of implementation research, and whether or not it is appropriate, even if not rigorous enough, for our different disciplines, and how it is that we're approaching our science, and then therefore how you're training students. For example, and one of the examples I gave for the work that we do is I have major assignments in my courses where students have to write a blog. They have to do a TED Talk. They have to communicate their research to people who are the end user and help them uptake and use it. Is that an appropriate assignment? And how do you grade that assignment? And how does an excellent blog demonstrate that you are becoming a rigorous scientist in our field, right? Those are real tensions, I think, when you do this work, because so much of what you do is actually outward facing of your discipline. I'll pass it to Trisha.
Well, much like your breakout room, we had just kind of gotten started on discussion. I will repeat one really important point. Emily Doolittle was asking, what are the lessons learned from our development project that might have influenced our iterative process to get better implementation data all along? Our answer was piloting in more diverse settings than where we had done our iterative work. But I would be interested to hear what others have done to iterate on reading interventions in ways that do then really support implementation outcomes as well as child outcomes. And something we didn't get to discuss, but I saw some vigorous head nodding, was during this real interesting space of the science of reading movement, what's happening in terms of de-implementation, and how as researchers can we help districts, teachers, to walk away from programs that they have invested a lot of time and money in, or that they just really like, and what's our role in helping them to de-implement?
Jess, how about your room?
We only got to one comment, so but we started talking a little bit about it. I know I'll just share kind of where I've been thinking a lot in doing this work, is really thinking more about mechanisms. So things that impact whether or not our implementation strategies and programs are leading to the outcomes that we want them to lead to, and being more purposeful in designing implementation strategies and programs that account for those mechanisms. Rather than just using them later to explain why we perhaps didn't get the outcomes that we wanted to get. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else in that room has thoughts or comments or questions more broadly that you wanted to share, or anyone else.
I'll jump in and make a comment. I think one thing that we can do as a field is acknowledge where we have points of agreement, that, you know, a package as a whole, we don't approve, that we don't believe that it's consistent with the science, but doesn't mean every single thing in that package was wrong to use or ineffective. So I think it's really important that we, particularly for teachers, acknowledge the things they've been doing all along that are still consistent with the science. So it doesn't feel like we're asking for just wholesale change.
I think what Kent just shared in the text of the blog from the Right to Read project, that makes some of those same points. Mm-hmm.
So clearly I should have left you all in there a little bit longer. I tried to split the difference and bring you back with enough time for discussion here, but you barely got going there. One thing that's just sort of resonating with me is the comment about what is our role? What are our collective roles or individual roles surrounding de-implementation? And I might argue that anyone interested in doing implementation has a bit of a responsibility to engage in some strategic de-implementation at the same time. You know, everyone's plates are perpetually full, and we often forget that when we're asking people to do yet another thing, and rarely are things taken away. So I would say we have a almost ethical, certainly practical, charge, if for those of us interested in doing implementation work, either research or practice, to be very conscious of the implementation needs in any setting.
I would agree. And I would, if I can offer up another thought related to that, is whether you're talking about de-implementation or adaptation or any of these other things that are hot issues right now, they require a different methodological approach that is not entirely quantitative. If you're going to take on a role that supports de-implementation, that means you're inserting yourself into a research space in a way that is not as objective as many of us may be comfortable with. And I certainly grew up in reading research world where you stay out. You're supposed to be more than arm's length away from what is happening in this context to really find a strong objective finding from the way that I do my research. But I find it for me that a lot of my discomfort around this work, although it's also exciting, is allowing for the fact that I might actually be a part of the research. And how do I account for that? Measure that? How do I know what is the line that you do and do not cross? Maybe those lines shouldn't be there. I don't know. What I know is there are whole fields of study around this, right, in these methodological approaches, and I don't know them. And it feels really not great to be so smart about stuff anymore, right? Because I know a lot of other stuff, but I don't know that. So there's real discomfort there. But I think if we want to see what we're looking for, it might require a little bit of learning of how to do work in that way. And that will take time, but it's also going to take a little grace for ourselves, I think.
Nicole, don't you think that implementation science and its implementation reality really sort of depends on developing relationships that are true research practice partnerships? You know, and if there's honest conversations going on, it's easier to have conversations that would facilitate the implementation, even though that may not be, you know, a primary goal.
I do think that I might be a little biased. I'm a big fan of partnership work. But I do think even if we're thinking about this from like a translational science perspective, and you're trying to get to the end where we get to scale and public health level change, things like third grade reading score change, that's what you're trying to get to, right? So to get to that requires a lot of vulnerability on the side of the people we're trying to work with. And it's hard to be vulnerable with people you don't know and you don't trust and who you don't think understand your context. So I do think figuring out the partnership side of this really matters to making this work successful. The tension with this is partnership is broadly defined. People define it in very different ways. You got to think about the grain size issues with that. It's one thing to be a really great partner with a local school district. It's another thing to be a really great partner with the entire Southeast region of the US for the REL. And I have to try to figure out how to do both. And they are not the same, but they function under the same idea that I'm going to get change if I am partnering. So that is a piece of this, but I think it's a piece we really need to work hard to understand. There's a whole world of community engaged scholarship out there. And I will just caution as you dig into that world, just as Aaron said, there are theory, models, and framework. Like, let's not make a new one. You don't need a new reading focused partnership. There's whole fields and years of study on this. Let's figure out how to incorporate what we already have learned into what we're doing instead of trying to come up with some new thing and then saying, look what we discovered. It's out there already.
And I think that all this requires a comfort with uncertainty and a lot of comfort with failure. Implementation science was born of failure and of the fact that most implementation efforts fail, and trying to do something about that and recognizing that that can be difficult to overcome because of all the different things that can influence that failure. That's why looking at mechanisms is one example of something so important, because it allows you to deconstruct possible failures and to be able to then see whether your at least theory of change for getting to that ultimate outcome, whatever your primary dependent variable was, and being able to sort of reverse engineer in a post-mortem kind of way, even worst case scenario, but that it still would yield important information.
One thing that we haven't touched on is thinking about how to articulate that in these changing times of promotion and tenure changing, and faculty governance and thinking changing. What counts? Does a blog count? Or does it have to be an article that's in a specific journal? As Nicole mentioned, sometimes we're beginning multidisciplinary collaborations where what counts in one department may not count in another. So I think part of the grace is going to be to collectively support one another, junior scholars and others, in articulating what matters. For translating implementation science is going to take a lot more work than a bench science article that might show up in a different type of journal. So thinking collectively about what counts for the greater good is a theme that I think's really come out of this, and hopefully it can be disentangled for what it takes for an annual evaluation or a big ticket like tenure.
I will say, Stephanie, and I'll put it in the chat if I can find it quickly, because I know we're out of time here and they're probably going to pull us out of this room. But the UC system has made some progress in that. And so you can find actual tenure guidance on community engaged scholarship in the UC system. Look at UC Santa Cruz, UC Berkeley, UC San Diego. They've made some progress there.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming to this end of day session. Sorry we didn't have as much time to chat. If we had, well, you can go to one of the networking events tomorrow. We can chat more there. If we were in person next year, we can have drinks and chat more. And I hope you have a great afternoon. Don't forget to rate the session when you, at the end of the, I don't know where it will pop up, but you will get a rating. Make sure you rate it. Thanks everyone.